So welcome to this panel discussion staged in relationship to the exhibition of David Hammons and Jannis Kounellis. So Kenya's already given you some of the context, but I think this is a really wonderful pairing to see in an exhibition because of the intimacy they both artists shared, the interest they had in each other's work, perhaps surprisingly, they're coming from very distinct locations, backgrounds, and yet, and also generations. And what you see in the exhibition at White Cube is a really wonderful series of pairings of works and a broader view on how materiality and various different forms of artistic expression and interests and tricksterism can be performed simultaneously by both of those artists. I mean, simultaneously in their own practices and simultaneously in their two separate practices. And it also marks this, well, it comes back to this very particular moment in art history, one which surprised me as well, even though I had curated an exhibition of Jannis Kounellis, that they had shown together in 1993 in a two-person exhibition curated by Martha Boyden in the gardens of the Villa Aurelia in Rome, as following on from David Hammons' residency in the American Academy in 1991. And this is a peculiar type of exhibition, or was a peculiar type of exhibition. You may have seen some of the documentation of that within the White Cube or in the materials that accompany the exhibition, as it was staged outside in the gardens in 2 tents. It wasn't a direct dialogue between the artists, but the kind of co-living space in some settings. And that situation shows some of the kind of playfulness and the willingness to move beyond the gallery of both of the artists. And I think it's really beautifully captured through the selection of works that both Madja and Sukanya have brought together and staged in the gallery, that look particularly towards shamanic transformations of poor objects, the Arte Povera as a term linked more with Jannis Kounellis, but also very clearly in the use of materials of David Hammons, and how those objects that are marked by quotidian use resonate with social and political and poetic significance. And so those are some of the issues we might explore within the work today with our panel, which I'm happy to welcome, of Adrienne, Julie, and Stanley. I have the formal introductions, which I will do now, but I have to read those. So Adrienne Edwards is Engelsch Bayer Family Senior Curator and Associate Director of Curatorial Programs at Whitney Museum of American Art. It's a very long title, actually. And Professor of Practice at Arizona State University. She recently curated Grace Rosario Perkins' Circles, Spokes, Zigzags, Rivers, the artist's first museum exhibition in New York City, which was from October 2025 to February 2026. And the blockbuster exhibitions Edges of Eiley, which was presented from September 24 to February 25. She co-curated the Whitney Biennial 2022, Keep Quiet as It's Kept, and enhanced the strength and vitality of the museum's performance program. She was part of the Whitney Museum's core team, specifically for David Hammons' public art project, Days End, which is permanently installed in front of the Whitney, and has been working with Whitney since 2018. Thank you for being with us. Julie Mehretu is a world-renowned American painter, born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1970. She received a Master's in Fine Art with honours from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1997. Mehretu is recipient of many awards, including the MacArthur Award in 2005 and the U.S. Department of State Medal of Arts Award. Sorry, that's also difficult to pronounce, from 2015. She has shown her work globally in numerous group and solo exhibitions and is represented in private and public collections around the world and lives in New York City. And I'm also pleased to say we're currently working together on an exhibition which will be in Mexico next year. Welcome, Julie. And then finally, welcome Stanley Whitney, who's an artist who lives and works in Bridgehampton, New York, and Parma, Italy. Whitney's work is held in a collection of many prominent museums, including those of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, Paris Art Museum Miami, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Buffalo AKG Art Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. In 2024, the Buffalo AKG Art Museum presented a major retrospective survey of Whitney's career, which traveled to the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis and the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. So thank you and welcome again. I'd like us to begin. I'm going to cycle through some images while we're talking as well. But I'd like us just to begin with introducing a little bit of our personal relationships or your personal relationships with David. I think is the main figure for the majority of you, also with Kounellis, just so we can understand that relationship. And I will begin with Adrienne and move this way because then Stanley, who was actually saw the exhibition in Rome in 93, will be able to give us a little bit of a more rounded introduction to what that was as well. So,
wow, I really think we should start with Stanley, but I'll start because I'll be short. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with Stanley and Julie. So very happy to be here. He's already told you my introduction to Mr. Hammons, but it was really working on Day's End. That started a long conversation that extended to Quiet as It's Kept, which is actually titled after a show that Mr. Hammons did in Vienna that included the work of Denise Tomasos, Stanley, and Ed Clark, which, I'd written about Ed's work. And David was, I would say, lurking in the background as I put together, luckily, Quiet as It's Kept. And I've actually never spoken about it, and I probably won't say very much here about it, but I consider it a couple of years of maybe the luckiest time in my life. And I would say I've had many wonderful teachers because I have way too many degrees. But what I really learned in that time with him was really how to do the work that I do now. So something like Edges of Ailey would not have happened had it not been for him. And I can go on, but I'll pass the mic.
Thank you also very much for asking me to participate and be with these wonderful people up here. It's an honor. Thank you all for coming. I unlike these guys, I don't have that long. I mean, I met David when I first started showing at the project, or even at Greater New York, I think. But so there was always these kind of small conversations that would happen here and there. We'd see each other in Harlem, and kids would meet him when he was out to dinner, or we'd run into him. But my favorite memory of David was in the White House. We were invited for an artist lunch, and a lot of people were there, and David was there, and he was starting to serve himself from the buffet, and he says to me, "Julie, take a photo of me. I want a photo of me in the White House, serving myself food." So, do you remember? And so we were, that was like that. And again, it was this way of like, he also worked with this Ethiopian curator who started this space in Addis Ababa, and he would take her out and he would do these kind of performances in the street uptown in Harlem with making bubbles for drivers passing by. and would do these performances in that way. But there was always something like that happening with him, and I miss seeing him around with the third eye with the third eye glasses, that he crafted, and his hat with holes.
Well, I met David in New York. I got to New York in '68, and David got here, I guess, '75, something like that. But I knew him from around New York, just seeing him. There was a bunch of, downtown those days, which is now Soho and all that, Tribeca. There were, although David lived in Harlem, but all the other, sort of Afro-American black artists, most of us lived downtown, the Bowery, or what is Soho or Tribeca. But then I saw him around a lot, but I tried to avoid him as much as I could. But then when I went to Rome, because at the time, I was in New York in '68, I did some shows, but nothing happened for me at all. And nothing was happening for most of us, the Afro-American artists at that time, downtown. If even people had museum shows, it didn't usually lead to a gallery or anything like that. So I had an opportunity to move to Rome to teach at Tyler School of Art, where I taught in Philadelphia a couple of days a week. But they had a school in Rome. So we packed our things, Marina Adams and I got married, and we packed our things and we went off to Rome. And David had been at the academy the year before, but he had a girlfriend in Rome. He came back to do the show with Kounellis. So that's when I really got to be really friends with David, And David would always come. We had a place in Trastevere, and David would always come by and hang out. Of course, we had to feed him, of course. And he would come by and we'd hang out, and we'd drink and we'd talk. And he was working on the show with Kounellis, who I had no interest in whatsoever, because I was there looking at Caravaggio and all the other Italian painters. And I thought, what is this that you're doing? Anyway, so he thought, well, I have this show I'm going to do, but I didn't know what the show was. And then, but one night he came by, and he'd always come by late at night. If the doorbell rang, here in New York or there, he'd yell up, and we knew it was David. He said, come by. And before that, we were sitting around talking. I was reading Ben Okri, The Famished Road. He was reading that. We were talking about that book. He was walking around Rome a lot, talking about the fountains and the water and where it came from and who had the water, who didn't have the water, and how rich that meant in terms of, the Romans, in terms of their wealth, in terms of their empire. And I was like, okay, but because I was thinking, about painting. So then when the show came up, I knew he was going to do the show with Kounellis. And so when the show came up finally, he came by one night. And in those days, Trastevere was really like a backwater. Trastevere was like a poor part of town. Before the bars were there. And so it really was a quiet time. Before, it was still the lira, before the European Union got together. He came by one night and he said, he took us up to see, he said he did the show, come on, Marina and I. And I remember it was a very beautiful night. I think even the moon, it's so romantic. The moon was out. We went up this back road up to the gardens, and he took us there, and there was two tents. So first we saw the Kounellis tent, with the big sort of bags of who knows what's in those things. And then he said, wait a second, don't go in my tent yet. And he goes in, he readjusts something. We don't know what he's doing. We're sitting out in the dark, thinking, when's he coming out of that tent? And he comes out of the tent, says, okay, go in. And we go in, and what's in there is he had made this contraption of this, he had an African mask. I don't know where he got that mask from. He had made this kind of container with sand, with a tube that went down to the mask, and instead of a fountain, sand came out. And it was so elegant and so magical. It was just like reading Ben Okri, you know. It was like that. And we were all like unbelievable. And it was just really, for us, I think Marina would say, a very special magic moment, you know, for seeing that like that, you know. So that's how I get to see the show. So I got very lucky. And after that, we became really dear friends. We did a show together in Naples, after William was born, because Marina came with William when he was a baby. And we did a show, Quiet as Kept, and we became dear friends. And always at night, dinner time, or late at night, the doorbell would ring, and we knew it was David.
Thank you for that. I think it's very important to hear about that kind of experience of the work. And I think both, that's possibly something that David Hammons and Jannis Kounellis shared, is that the experience of a work could be that personal, and it could also be theatrical. Yeah,
because I think it was Kounellis who decided to do the tents. I think Kounellis was the one who said, we'll do the tents. Yeah, that was his idea.
Yeah, I think that from what I understood as well for this particular project, it was really almost a contingency. The building was under renovation and they were producing an exhibition. It's like, well, how are we going to do this in the garden? And the military tents, in the end, they were military tents. They were the only ones they could find that were big enough, effectively. So, but that kind of negotiation with the reality of the world is something that I think is very present in both of those artists' work, of going out, finding materials, bringing them back. I think just shortly before you also mentioned you wouldn't necessarily know where this material came from.
No, with David, you never knew. You didn't know. You never knew everything about David. David always kept things so. Everything was always a surprise. You know, you never knew with David where. You know, I don't think he showed any one person everything he ever did. There was always big surprises. You know, like we hung out maybe in over 20 years, but I don't think I knew a lot about. I was always full of surprises. You know, things he would show me or things I would find out. We spent a lot of time because we liked to walk the streets, so we used to walk the streets a lot in Rome and in Vienna and all the time we talk, and so it was always a very interesting conversation, but you never got the full story all the time.
Okay. So I'm just going back to the White Cube exhibition and trying to talk a little bit more about what we see in the work of Kounellis and of Hammons through this show. I mean, I found this a very interesting quote, and it's quite heavy, I suppose, in some ways, in Martin Herbert's essay that was written in relationship to this exhibition. And he says that Hammons was in Los Angeles in the 60s asking, in quotes, how life's brutalities could show up in art, as had been Kounellis for the decade before. And I found this because there is something heavy about their work. It's physically heavy and it's metaphorically heavy. Yet at the same time, I think it also shows a lot of intimacy in the practice. So I'd like to invite you, all three of you, to speak a little bit about what you have seen in this exhibition and within the work that might be shared conditions between Kounellis and Hammons. What are these points of contact that you respond to in the White Cube exhibition?
I'm happy to start. I think it's almost, and this word is often overused, I believe, uncanny, but the correlation between them in terms of material is actually truly remarkable. Of course, they're this very same generation. They're both born during World War II, although Hammond's here in the States, and Kounellis would have had a much more intimate proximity to what was happening. But I do think the fact that even they both used furniture, clothing, even flies, musical instruments, I mean, it's kind of remarkable. I think one of the things I might offer is actually, I'm turning towards something that Stanley just said about Mr. Hammons, which is you never quite know the story, right? Like you never can fully know the story. I would say that absence is as much a material for him as anything else. And I think this is actually true for Kounellis too. So it's like what doesn't arrive in the room is something we should always be asking, or in the space. And I'll just tell you a story about Days End. So at the Whitney, when we did Days End and Mr. Hammons would come and hang out and talk about everything but art, it was very interesting because he was very clear to say to me, it's not just about Gordon Matta Clark. And I was like, what? Because whenever he spoke to the press or anybody else in the museum, he'd be like, oh yeah, it's a tribute. We're honoring Gordon Matta Clark. In my office, it was not just Gordon Matta Clark. And what it was in fact, and this I should give credit to Joan Crawford, who was Gordon Matta Clark's widow, who actually gave a talk about this some years ago, even before Days End was a reality, where she explained that Gordon had come across this homeless Black man when he was working on a project down under like right around the Brooklyn Bridge. And this man, Gordon was really fascinated with how he was building these different structures out of material that he had found, out of necessity, out of his precarity in order to make shelter. And he was inspired to do the cuts in these different constructions, including Days End, because he saw how this man built his home. And Gordon, and so Mr. Hammons, I think, was really asking the question of, you all think I am honoring Gordon Matta Clark, but you have to ask yourself, what is the precedent to Gordon Matta Clark's creativity, to his genius, which, thanks to his spouse, we now know. But that's in a YouTube video that you have to dig through to find. Where I'm going with this is actually to offer a word that I've been thinking a lot as I was preparing for today, and something I've been thinking about for a while now, which is the word catastrophe. And catastrophe is something that we think we really know what it means, right? Like an abomination, the end, violence, etc. But if you look at catastrophe etymologically, what you realize is that it means that it refers to something that is a reversal of what is expected. Could you not find a better way to think about these two artists and what they're doing materially? A reversal of what is expected. It is also a turning over, which is a kind of facetedness. So like Hammons might put a chicken wing in front of you, or Kounellis might put a horse in front of you. And the task that is set in front of you is actually to then turn it. What are the different facets and meanings that might be grasped in relationship to this? And then I would lastly say that catastrophe is actually also, it is the moment that indicates the final act is next in tragedies. So there's actually a theatrical reference there. So if you think, and this is important because Kounellis talks often in his work about tragedy in relationship to theater as a point of reference. So I find this like, and I think for Kounellis, what tragedy is in terms of a theatrical device is, for Hammons, we could substitute music, right? Very easily. So the point is, there are these things in front of us to grapple with, but it's really actually more phenomenological. It's like between yourself and the thing that is meaning me as a viewer or you as a viewer, and the thing that has been made. It is as much about your own individual personal relationship to it as it is about the thing itself. It's never just, and therefore you get this multifacetedness. It's like endless possibilities. And I think that's important when you think about a generation that has come up in really precarious times, because it's like you could also ask, well, when does the war end? It never ends, right? It's like this ongoing, constant presence in modern life. It marks modernity, in fact. So I'll stop there.
In a war. I like the way you talked about the facetness of, because for me, when I went in and I experienced the show, and I'm gonna, having loved David Hammons' work for so long and having experienced Jannis Kounellis much less, and having experienced it here before at the Gavin Brown show, having experienced with the horses, and having experienced the extraordinary show that was in Venice, I think 2 years ago, or maybe a while ago. Yeah, 19. So that was even a while. Yeah. It's interesting because I didn't even know that they had a show before until Sonia told us, and I learned this also from Mathieu. But so I walk into the gallery and I just loved how it felt like a dance. Like this, it's really choreographed, the experience of seeing this work. There's this choreography that I felt. And you see the text paintings, what are they called? Alphabetto paintings, with the signs and the way the letters are crafted. And there's something about the way that that's done that just feels so much like, I come from Ethiopia. I live in Harlem. And this feels like so much of the street signage you would see. And yet there's a kind of beat to it. There's this musicality. There's this kind of aspect to it that is doing something else. It's actually like giving these letters this kind of agency, these symbols and these signs, and yet it's also kind of playing with this fascistic history and negotiating of this time. But then, to me, the way that moves into this really elegant, sly body shape that's actually a static sculpture, but is wearing a baseball cap under this rubber gown. The kind of regal elegance and beauty of the way that piece stands. And this is what always takes my breath away with Hammons. It's the engagement with this, what happens, even if it was the piece that was with the blue lights at Ace, how to see, Yeah, Concerto in Blue. That was like the beauty of that, once you realized what that was, it was actually all of us with these lights in this enormous space. The basketball drawing and the kind of the absence of this kind of rising sense of almost a figure inside of it, and the kind of hauntingness of the beat that you feel in that. And to me, these are the kind of experiences that I was having in the room. And I kept going back to Kounellis, and with the Kounellis for me, interestingly, there was more. It wasn't until upstairs that I started to actually feel like the Alphabetto paintings, you get some of the beat and some of this intimacy. But then it wasn't until I saw the steel pieces or the iron pieces with the flowers. Is it called a marriage bed? I think the title is. It's the size of a marriage bed in Italy, but it's an untitled work. But then it's on the wall. It's not flat. It operates really like this very formal artwork. And they both are very formal artists. And so with David, whether it's a grease-stained paper bag that's folded into a beautiful kind of fan, kind of abstract sculpture wall drawing piece, whatever it is, there's the kind of desire to work with this materiality that is the detritus of life in many ways, and the desire to work with that and play within the systems of capitalization, within the systems of the commerce, which is the gallery, which in the system of exchange, having come from a people who were exchanged, having come from people as capital, it always, that's what strikes me so deeply about the kind of deeply human feel of and touch in that work. And so that's where, to me, the brutality is the history, but then this work is kind of beautifully being sly in that space. And part of the reason that I'm thinking about this history of capital and humans as capital and humans as being exchanged and valued in those ways, and the dehumanization that happens in that, is that we talk about them so much as these tricksters, and I think even the idea of a trickster is plain. There's something intense in that space, because survival then is there. You have to be kind of smart and witty and able to do something that the system is not letting you do or be. And so I think there's this tricksterness, and there's a little bit, there is some humor, but there's also a very deep, serious project happening in that. And so, and you feel that with both of these. And I felt it more like Kounellis. I think, to me, Kounellis, it's harder for me to feel the kind of that same drive, because what I really also love about David Hammons and the work of David Hammons, and we were talking about this yesterday when we saw the show, is when you look at a rockhead, it's such an experience for people who have grown up with people of color and Black folks in your family. And it reminds, we were talking about this yesterday, like kids who are shaped, you make fun of each other's head when your hair is cut and it's a different shape, and you have these different head shapes. And so there's something really, there's this beautiful kind of way and loving way that this work is made for a very specific audience at the same time, and reaching something else broader. And the Kounellis, I feel, is participating in that, but I don't have the same access to that cultural source in the same way.
Yeah.
That post-war, devastated Greek into a rebuilding Italy, and what it meant to then create out of that. And I know that Arte Povera was you were explaining so much also earlier, how important that was for Hammons. But for me, growing up, I grew up looking at Hammons. Since I moved to New York, he was such an important figure for me. And it's again, and that feeling that comes, whether it's the body prints, whether it's sculpture, whether it's these stone heads, there's something in them that's so familiar. And then also, even the tarp paintings, that's so accessible and yet there's this kind of formal visual elegance that plays with that. And to me, there's something super potent in that I register with in a way. So seeing this show with them together really, I think, brought me to ask many more questions about Kounellis. And then that's when I learned about the marriage bed, or I learned that there was these other elements that I feel there's a little bit more of a formal distance for me with that work. And so it's just interesting to think about that.
Yeah, I just have to say this because it's come up multiple times. I actually just want to pressure a little bit this description of him as a trickster.
I agree.
Because I think it elides the level of strategy at which this man operates, with such precision and deftness and levity that I think it gets mischaracterized.
Yeah.
I think that this is a mind-blowingly strategic person.
Yeah, I think he really was a poet. Yeah. He's a poet. I think, Kounellis is a European artist and David's an American artist. And that seems real clear in terms of the work. There's a playfulness and a much more bigger playfulness in David's work in terms of where he'll go. I think if you look at the piece with the wine piece, the wine bottle piece. Now, all those wine
Oh,
bottles.
are those wine bottles?
All those wine bottles were probably all drank by these winos all over Harlem. And he takes these wine, and people, where I grew up, there were always winos. You know what I mean? There were always winos where I grew up. And so, you think, oh, the wino guys, they were always there. But to take that and to take those wine bottles, now that wine is not really wine they're drinking. That wine is just pure poison. I mean, have you ever heard of Thunderbird? Those wines like that, Tagaroor, that wine is not even wine. And to take that bottle, which you could find on any street, any ghetto, and make something that beautiful out of it, and to take these people and do that's poetry.
Exactly, and it's the poetics that I feel, and I, to be fair, I did start to also feel that with some of the pieces, the Kounellis pieces, the Cole, the sax of Cole. I feel that more upstairs, or the kind of jazz you feel in the.
And then you have the humor. You have the humor. You have the humor.
But it's not the same as this. There's something else in that the precision you're talking about. This really. Intentional, this is the reason also David was concerned about valuation of the works and prices and who participates, where, why, and the reason and why. And I was trying to think it through, like capital. Why is that that keeps becoming this material that he does not bring into the room, but that he's playing with in terms of the place of exchange. And it's really profound how he plays with that, and in terms of especially what you were just saying, like who's touched this history,
who touched it. I mean, the hair thing. If you grew up hair, Black community, hair was everything. Sometimes when you were born, people say, "Oh, you got good hair." You're lucky you got good hair. I mean, hair was a big thing, and to take that, he would take. I saw one time, I think with David, he would take a hat and spend all day. We would sit around talking all day. He's sewing hair on a hat. We're talking all day. He's sewing hair on a hat, pieces of hair on a hat, just sewing. He could sew all day. He brings really. I think with David, he brings a female into it that you don't really see in Kounellis. I think David brings a bigger range in terms of people, the female, the male, people with nothing, the rock with the hair. He could take. I was with him one time in Zurich. We're walking down the street in Zurich, and David's a hold on. I'm going to the shop. I said, "That's a woman's shop. What are you going to that shop for?" He saw something in that shop. I said, "What do you want to get in this shop?" He got this woman's raincoat. I said, "It's a woman's rain. What are you going?" Next time I saw that raincoat, I thought, "Damn, he had transformed this thing." So when you look at those paintings with the covers on it, he could have been a fashion designer. I mean, the man could have been a fashion designer. I mean, he had that ability. He could sew. He didn't mind working all day. He could be quiet. He was really magic. I think David really, and I think with David too, had that playfulness that's really in that Black community, that he brings through the work. That is just really unbelievable. I think in terms of Duchamp, I think of David more in terms of almost Rauschenberg. If you see the Rauschenberg show, go see the Duchamp show, the Rauschenberg show, as a little piece of show, it goes in, and then David's show. Because I think those two artists, they had high antenna. They could see something on the street and you think it's trash, and that's not trash, that's a diamond. They could take that trash and transform, what I mean? And even his paintings, because he couldn't really paint, but he covered those things and voila.
But he loved painting.
Voila. You know what I mean? Voila. He took that tarp, threw across that painting, and boom. Because I would like, wow, because I know those paintings weren't very good. Boom.
I think he would say it wasn't very good.
What?
I think he would say it wasn't very good.
No, he told me it wasn't very. I know, but he just knew how to. He could see things. That's why I thought, like when I knew Rauschenberg, he could see things that we couldn't see. He could see things walking down the street. He could see things.
But part of that is also the museum, this space where you go to look at art, this ceremonial kind of way of moving and this quiet.
He had a hard time with that.
And he had art.
Yeah.
But what I love about the tarp paintings is the way that they take you back to the street. And whenever you're walking by a construction site, which is considered this kind of sore, there's so much majesty in the way that I've ever looked at them since. And so that for me, that's another part of how David stays in the psyche that's also really kind of amazing. And
yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I keep thinking about this thing that Kounellis, how he would describe like the stakes of his making, which was that it was about presenting something, not representing something. Yeah. And I feel like that is something that really connects these two.
I think so too. Yeah, because the show that Kounellis did in Venice, that show, what a show! With the shoes and the things on the ceiling.
Was that his last show?
I don't know if it was his last show. I forget what year that was, but that was a magical show. I think that was the best Kounellis show I ever saw.
It was at Prada, I believe.
Yeah, Prada, yeah. I thought that was a great, great show. I mean, definitely they were connected in terms of, how they went about making their art, how they saw things, how poetic they were. And you can see why David really loved Kounellis. Because when I met David in Rome, I wasn't interested in Kounellis at all. I thought, I don't know what you're talking about. But I really got what they were about and really realized how important that was and opened my eyes to that. Because I wasn't really involved with Kounellis. So I think, they had a lot in common, definitely. I mean, I think David would be very happy with, if he hadn't seen this show, I think he'd be very happy with this show.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much there that we could go back to. I wanted to talk about the trickster side a bit, because I think there's a misconception of what trickster means. Like we think it's like a jester. But of course, a trickster is actually a very deeply ritualized kind of role in many ways. It's a theatrical role who, a bit like a court jester in a more medieval sense, of the one who reminds the power that they are not actually, they are there at the privilege of the people. The court jester who whispers in the ear of the emperor, and the trickster in has that kind of role rather than being just humorous. It's not they're not a clown, and I feel that touches on some of those other aspects of how Hammons and Kounellis were, through that presentation of materials, in some ways speaking to power, or reflecting back the kind of limits of power.
I think this is a perfect example of, depending on where you sit in the world, contours the way in which you think about something. So for you, the reference might be the court jester, right? For me, and I would suggest also possibly for Mr. Hammons, it might be the Uncle Remus stories. It might be the Tar Baby story, right? And then in that context, the trickster has to sacrifice itself in order to actually free itself. So I think in terms of how we think about what language is and how it functions, right, there are always a multitude of ways in which we can enter it. I'm suggesting that I think it's just become quite easy for us, and I do really believe it belies something that is actually, I mean, this person understands art so totally and completely that he has digested the last 600 years of it. So to suggest that humor is or a felicity with material and to laugh about it. One survives these situations by laughing about them. You have to think of the entire arc of which he has had to come to even arrive to this moment. So this is why I'm being very rigorous about language, which for me has a very specific historical and narrative arc.
Yeah, I mean, partly what I was meaning by that was exactly what you're just describing, because I could introduce possibly a third character into this, which is Jimmy Durham. Jimmy Durham is also known as the trickster. You can see certain material similarities, and also was familiar with Jannis Kounellis. I don't know if he was familiar with David Hammons in Italy at that same time. So there's a kind of, and his tricksterism comes from another different cultural perspective, from a Native American idea of a trickster within a very particular belief structure and what the trickster does within that. So I completely agree with you that to blanket term anything under a tricksterism is problematic because it comes from specific areas. The other thing I think, which also is both culturally orientated, but also a shared surface, we could say, of using the found materials. In this idea of David Hammons using the bottles that have been, to quote, a black person's lips have touched each and every one, so you have to be very, very careful. But they're objects that have been in circulation, use, and thrown away and been recycled. And in Kounellis, I think the choice of materials is equally very precise. It's not a composition of any material. They're nearly always materials that are used within global trade. They're fragments of boats that are no longer in use. They've been moved on. They're post-war, they're redundant materials, but they're all about global movement and trade. And I could point, there was one work within the Jannis Kounellis in 6 acts that Kounellis made here in New York, which was like a shelf piece for the steel kind of canvases, we could say, because Kounellis saw himself as painting, even when it was quite far away from that in material terms. And on it was a kind of collection of glassware from a secondhand store, completely covered in fingerprints. Every piece of glass had been used by a family, thrown away, picked up, put back into circulation. But it's so close. And yet, so also coming from a completely different meaning. It's like about the post-war emigration, the kind of that being thrown out of one's homeland. Whereas perhaps you might say in Hammons, it's talking about the dispossession of being in one's own homeland, just as one possible contrast and similarity that cross at the same time. But I think is where the meaning of both of their works come through. There's something very human and the movement of humans within their work.
I was just going to say, because you suggested Jimmy Durham, I would like to just enter into the room Stanley Brown, because Stanley Brown is such an important artist for Mr. Hammons, I believe, in terms of how we might be able to trace and understand some of the choreographies that he's worked with in terms of how absence works, and also what's visible, what's not. Sorry, Julie.
I don't know. Oh yeah, I was just the fingerprints on the iron pieces. You see that on all of those. That is one element of touch that I did feel in the Kounellis works is the residual of the hand and those elements, and you see that also in the paintings, in the alphabetto paintings. But then there's an industrialness after that, and it's a constructed industrialness that with Hammons, you know, you have the bed on the wall. Let's call it the marriage bed, untitled, with the flowers. But then you have, you know, hair relaxer, which is this elegant sofa with all this hair that's, you know, collected. Or I've heard stories, I'm not sure, but collected from barbershops and such, and people, and and filled in this chair that's really this lounge chair for relaxing. And the kind of there's this seduction and feel and touch and history in that, but there's a familiarity of what kind of house that chair would be and who would want that, what that does, where it comes, that whole narrative around that history. And to me, I go through to many of the novels that I've read and my own experiences in Harlem, and I see certain things there. But what I think, to me, what happens that's very different with Kounellis is that Kounellis has to, like, there's this formal construction of something that not that David doesn't do that, because he does that with the bottles, but there's this other touch that happens there. There's this human, I don't know, this is where I go back to pulling from this other past. And one of the reasons for me the trickster word becomes a very complicated word, because it's not just, it's used a lot. I think it's actually even maybe in the press release. It's used very much around the essays. Even I think the main text uses this language. And for me, it brings, I don't know why I was having, you know, internally this kind of uncomfortable feeling around it. And it was in trying to dig into that I felt like, because I don't see it in that way so much as that. I see it as being so much like, some people see the art paintings as being so much the opposite of like the need to hide the painting or cover the painting. Then I got it. But actually, I find them as being so such like altar pieces. They have this kind of formality and this kind of the beauty in the material and the color and the shimmer and what you see through. But then there's this beautiful kind of natsui-ness to the way that they fall, and that to me, there's something like coronate, like the kind of vibe of a coronation. You know what I mean? Like it has this kind of splendor, resplendence in it. Like and in that that's that formal kind of, this is, I don't know. There's this kind of other sense, and that's when I feel. He's looking at paintings. He's looking at everything. You see, you can't create that kind of thing without that. There's like Brancusi in that. And then there's also Bernini in that. It's not just, you know.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. I think when you say trickster, no matter how you define it, it's kind of like saying jazz, you know. To like Bud Powell or something. People say, "Oh, that's jazz." What does that mean when people say jazz? It's there are some really brilliant people who play this music, and I think trickster, in terms of, you know, with David, I think, or even anyone, I think, takes away from something really sophistication, deep thoughts, you know, and how he really is involved with the world in so many different ways, whether it's, you know, just community, whether it's black, whether it's, he goes everywhere, wherever, he can go anywhere he wants to gather things to make this thing very, very special. And that's what he does, I think, even how he covers those paintings. He'll go anywhere and do anything to make, and he knows, and he's so sensitive as an artist.
There's a reverence there.
Yeah, that he can take something and turn it into something that we've never seen before, you know. And that's the brilliance of the artists. I mean, Kounellis is too. That's the brilliance of the artists. They take things and they can take it and make it something that you think, where'd this come from? And they're working in every kind of way, physically, mentally, every kind of way, to really be able to get in this space. It's like if anyone here, I'm sure some of you have been to a poetry reading and heard a great poet read, and how special and how unusual that is, to hear a really great poet read. And that's what these artists are, They take you to a space that will open up things for you that you didn't know maybe existed.
I was just going to say, it's important, I think, to just acknowledge the different or the many formalisms at play here. You made me think about this, Stanley, when you turn towards jazz. But like when Germano Salant begins, like I looked at the catalog from 1969 of Arte Povera, and when he's talking about it, he's like, this is not like Liechtenstein, essentially, right? Like these artists are doing something really, really different. And trying to situate it in the context of like representation in the Western canon. And I would say that he also, in terms of Kounellis, thought a lot about Impressionism, thought a lot about the arc of Western art history, specifically painting. Hammons has all of that, plus this whole other tradition and set of iconographies and symbols that he's drawing upon that comes out of Black Americana. Yeah. The magic is what happens when you turn over those things together rigorously, and that's what you get.
Totally. And I think one of the other, I think that's on point. And also, I was thinking about like the history of Arte Povera and this idea of the tabula rasa, the idea of this total break from the past, the idea of eradicating the past and starting something else, like the mumbling of Dada, like working with these materials that are the foundations of a fresco, plaster, and wealth, and the history of who has access to that. And there's kind of breakdown of trying to create something else. We're just going to show the plaster as the art on the shelf, just going to show the sacks of coal. This very much going back to the beginning. Whereas Hammons there's never the desire to eradicate anything of the past. It's this constant hum throughout all of it. It's the constant, tenor in the work. And that's just fundamentally the different kind of histories, I think, coming from that divide in the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things I found interesting about the Sand Fountain, which was a kind of work of David Hammons that I'd never really seen. And because that has perhaps a more similar longing for but I think Kounellis, as a Greek man going to Rome because of classicism and at the same time looking for modernity, within his use of references to classical Greek theatre structures, classical Greek masks, figures like Dionysus appear in he adopts these kind of characters in certain performances. I mean, in Sonnabend, there's an image here. But there's a longing for something that is both wanting to be radically new and longing to be historically connected, because something's been lost in between. And the David Hammons Sand Fountains seem to speak to a similar notion. It's like it was this civilization, a Roman civilization that was a colonialism that in some ways destroyed a civilization in Africa, which is something that could be longed for, but without, in a sort of glissant sense, never has any direct contact. And at that moment, there seemed to be an interesting, like what you were describing about that history is always still there. But in that Sound Fountain, it seemed to be like speaking to something that had been lost. I mean, it's just a kind of musing on that particular work, because it seemed so distant to me, seeing a piece in the showing with Kounellis in Italy, from what I was familiar with in the assemblages of more street found materials, more the detritus. It seemed to place those African masks back into a position of reverence, going back to what you said.
I don't think it's so much the mask. I think with David, he really wanted to show the sophistication and the brilliance of black culture that really gets lost in this country. You know what I mean? And I think he really wants to really show people really the intellect. I think people in this country don't realize. I think even to the Native Americans, and even in the past, people don't think of them as having the intellectuals and the intellectuals. That kind of history gets lost. There was a point, when the Europeans came here, and they did take some Native American intellectuals back to France, to Paris. You know what I mean? And the Native Americans at that time, just laughed at the Europeans in terms of how they were and what was important to them. I think David really, he raised a lot of questions. He brings up a lot of issues, and I think Toni Morrison's a good person to really bring up in terms of David, in terms of her writings and how brilliant she was and what she wrote about and what she talked about and how she talked about it and how brilliant that work is. So I think with David, it's a real brilliance, and then there's a real humor. It's really fun, ha ha ha. It's really humor, but at the same time, there's this really underlying. I think there's a real reason why, even when David came here from L.A., he chose to live in Harlem. Most of us live downtown on Bowery, but he really wanted to live in Harlem, and I think that he's coming from L.A. too, so Illinois to Harlem, and that history and what that is. And I think he just wanted people to really see that brilliance. And sometimes, that gets lost in this bigger sort of wider culture. And he just really go anywhere using anything to really show you that brilliance. And I was always impressed by his intellect, even though I don't know how many books the man read, but he was really such a brilliant, and he's still with, he's still around, he's not gone yet, brilliant person in terms of his thinking. So, because I just think the work really has so many ways so many ways. Even the basketball things, what he did with basketball and the chandelier, these beautiful chandeliers, but they're basketball, you know what I mean? Of what basketball is. And why do Afro-Americans, they play basketball, but they don't own any basketball teams, and what that is. So I think he raises lots and lots of questions in so many ways, and that's the brilliance of the man.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we're going to move to some questions or comments from the audience now, if anybody wants to raise a hand. So I think we'll wait for the microphone because they are recording. There's a question down here at the front. Thank you.
When you've been talking about both Kounellis and Hammons, and they come out of different cultures, Kounellis, of course, European, and Hammons from America, you've not made any reference to the history of Kounellis having worked in post-war Europe and what impact that had on his work versus, let's say, Hammons, who was American, who didn't have that experience, and his materials came rather from the street. Could you address that? Why not? Or any of you? Yeah.
All of us.
Well, that's, I think, what I was trying to say when I was talking about leaving devastated Greece devastated from the war, coming to Rome for, like you said, the history of classicism, but also modernity. And Rome, Italy being in the throes of this enormous kind of restoration, or whatever you want to call it. And that there is the materials he's working with and showing us are those industrial materials. It's all like the carbonaras, the coals, the sacks of the coal, the iron, the kind of way he's working with that, the letters, the graphics, the kind of the marching of those letters, the kind of directionality of them. There's so much of that feeling in that, but there's also it's like trying to, there's, you know, there's a different formality to what's happening in there. And you're the one who said earlier that he avoided, he didn't want to be seen as a minimalist, from what you said.
Well, actually, that's more my interpretation. He didn't want to be seen as part of the Arte Povera group after a very short space of time. I mean, that group didn't really exist. It was kind of created as a exhibition, and they were working in the same place. I'm sure they were friends and enemies, and drank together and partied together and stole each other's ideas, and you know, and it fell apart quite quickly. Any sense of camaraderie between them, but Jannis Kounellis in particular was wanting to be more distant. What I was mentioning, which goes back a bit to your point, is that it's an interpretation of my own. But the Arte Povera and minimalism are like parallel identities. One is of a reconstructed United States of industrialism and post-war boom. It's like, and the reaction to that is a highly polished, highly fabricated, no sense of touch, a surface with no sense of touch. In Europe, you have the opposite of like a post-war. All the glory of Europe has just fallen in on itself and become rubble. And so the abstract object, the abstract sculpture, is made from these kind of derelictions, the industrial dereliction, the economic dereliction. But that's more my own possible interpretation. But I think it's also important that Jannis Kounellis was not just leaving a devastated Greece from post-Second World War, but it was still having a civil war. He was running from a civil war. And so Greece it was the very economic fringes of Europe at that point, Western Europe anyway. I mean, it was the furthest geographical point you could go in Western Europe. It was absolutely economically destroyed and was still going through turmoil. And Kounellis arrives more in Rome, almost as there's some sense of modernism. There's the Alphabetto paintings are more in response to advertising and graphics and a kind of language of the street, which touches on an equivalent of pop art, you could say, but in a very different articulation about it, because it seems to be slightly hybridized with kind of what's been abandoned in the kind of radical, more Germanic idea of art in, I forgot the name, what's the place in Zurich? The theatre, the Cabaret Voltaire. It's like that was what was happening, and it's like gone because it was in a Germanic region. So there's lots of things one could explore within that.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think, yes, it was certainly very different in terms of what was happening in Europe in terms of material. The people who were taking up so much space in the museums and in galleries happened to have one kind of aesthetic, right? That pristine minimalism. But as we know from Lucy Lepard's work, there was an eccentric abstraction. There was a lush conceptualism, as I call it, very much afoot. It's just the folks that were making that work were not canonized, so to speak, in the same way.
Yeah, and Kounellis coming to the States in the 70s, he's showing in Sonnabend. And because he is being identified, he makes big steel things. He's been identified in relationship to minimalism, and he fits that mold. And that's, again, trickster is not the right word, but that's when he's coming and doing completely the opposite. He's standing in a case, a metal cube, with somebody playing phrases of Mozart on a flute and with a Greek mask in front of him. I mean, it's quite. There was another piece which I don't think we have in this presentation, which we showed him from also produced in Sonnabend, which was a sewing machine and a kind of a frame made of photographs of immigrants from to New York in the late 1800s that he'd found in a flea market. It was a vacant space in the middle. And then the sewing machine had been used to do the outline silhouette of a woman's face who happened to be Rebecca Horn. It was like, it's the silhouette of Rebecca Horn. And again, just kind of very much an flow of people, I think. The flow, and it was in relationship to the kind of sweatshop fabric what do you call it, factories in New York. It was, and this kind of flow of people that was kind of completely the opposite, deliberately so, of what was being expected of him as a man known for making big steel objects. So therefore he fits within a minimalist tradition. And I think that's an important part of the poetry. But going back to what you were saying, these are poetic people, not this. They can be intellectual, but what they're producing is a form of poetic association between materials, social conditions, histories, and that's what makes the work very rich, I think. So I feel like. Another question here.
You both have, all of you, but you both, the artists have spoke eloquently, insightfully about David's practice and all of that. But at least on the surface, your practices are quite different. And I'm super curious how what he's done has influenced what you paint, how you paint, and your practices specifically.
I'll go first with some longer stories. So, you know, I'm very much a painter. I'm very, you know, I'm very committed to painting. Always have been. And painting chose me. Like it's what I do. It's how I think. It's how I work. I wish I could be a different kind of artist at times, but you know, I think that this is, you know, it's a constant life of realizing who you are and understanding that, learning that. But what I have learned is I'm really fortunate enough to live with one of David Hammons' body prints. And it is still a talisman to me. Every day I go to the studio to try and make something that moves me as much as that piece. So for me, that's how simple it can be. I have been so moved by some of these tarp paintings and by many of the works I've ever seen. But there's usually, with the ones of his works that move me the most, have this absence, this haunting, there's something sublime in them that keeps nagging at me and that keeps pulling. And it's in that space, that's kind of what I'm going for in what I'm trying to do with my painting.
Well, for me, I think both artists, I mean, Kounellis too, are people who work at such a high level in terms of what they do and what they address, that's, you know, I mean, I don't really care what medium artists use, whether a painter, sculptor, poet, or writer. It's just if they're working at a very, very high level. So with David and I, it was more, we were sort of intrigued with each other in terms of being so different, but yet our conversation, when we talked, you wouldn't realize I was a painter and he was whatever he was, sculpture painter. He was everything. It was really the conversation we would have about things, you know. It was what we both strive for, you know. I think that's the whole thing. Even in the show, I mean, even though one's an American artist, one's a European artist, what are they really both striving for? What are they both really addressing in terms of humanity? And whether you're good at, you know, painting a figure, if that's the thing that gets you going, whether you're good at picking things off the street and turning it into magic, I mean, with Kounellis, I think one time I saw a piece of Kounellis that was a big hole someone collector had, and in it was all these bells, big church bells, without the ding dong thing in the middle, just piled in this hole. You know what I mean? And it was just magical. So these people you're after people who really somehow can just grab the magic, and so they both do, and there are others too. So that's how people thought we were a really odd couple, because, usually I would travel with David, and I'd be his sidekick, because no one knew who I was or cared at that point. And so, but I didn't mind that, because I was with him and he was so brilliant. So we had great conversations about everything, not about art, about anything. And so that's what you really want what do you want from art? What do you want on your wall? What do you want in your garden? What do you can have around you that kind of keeps you, in a really good space, and deal with this world. So I think both those artists are just very special. So that was the whole thing with me, with the conversation.
We have time for one more question. There's one right by the cameras there.
The first thing is just a very quick comment, which is maybe helpful about Kounellis's work in those tents in the Villa Aurelia, because it was these 3 sacks filled with this uncertain material, 2 of which were earth. One was pyrite and one was sulfite, and one was the crushed plaster sculpts of plaster casts of neoclassical sculpture. And the viewer wouldn't know this, but the viewer was invited in to touch and feel. And so if you want to talk about touch, it sort of reverse course. I guess that's a catastrophe. And then, I'm sorry to make a comment during a Q&A portion, but the next thing I have is a question, which is about the terms of engagement of the exhibition in Rome, because it was Kounellis's idea to have the military tents. Right. And the Italian military actually entered the space of the Villa Aurelia and set up the tents. So you had a Kounellis-style performance occurring before the exhibition. And my understanding is it was pitched to David Hammons not as a question, but as a assertion. These are the terms of the exhibition. This is the terms of engagement. And in classic form, with tremendous generosity, he made this magnificent fountain or anti-fountain within the space. I would love to hear what you make of the shared environment of exhibition when it's separated out. The actual literal phrase that Jannis Kounellis says in the interview that he gave for the catalog is separate but equal for the environment of the tents. And I would love to hear what happens for you when you think about a shared exhibition space that's identical but separated, and how that affects the perception of 2 very different practices that are made equivalent.
Does shared equal?
Well, seeing the show, I thought it was all really brilliant. I didn't know Kounellis's work at the time, when that happened. I was just really beginning to get along, to meet David and hang out with David. So I didn't. You're right about all that. I don't really. I mean, it was Kounellis who made the conditions that way. So that's all I know about it. I mean, I didn't know the practice that well at that time.
Yeah, I mean, from what I'd understood with reading through Martha Boyden's text as well, she was very clear. This is a 2-person show. It is not a dialogue. It is not a collaboration. But she had chosen to show these 2 artists primarily from knowing the interest David Hammons has in Kounellis and the apparent, the slightly surprising situation for most people that David Hammons would have this and have had for some time such a strong interest in Kounellis.
Yeah, I think you see by the photograph and then standing there in the catalog how happy David was. You can see that out. He's really thrilled to be standing there by Kounellis. You know, I mean, you can see that in the catalog. So I think for David, it was just really just, you know, he was wondering how he's going to address the situation, what he's going to do, and he came with a good solution. But I think just being with Kounellis, I mean, the man who put the horses in the gallery, was just more than he ever dreamed. I think it was a dream come true to be able to do a show with him, and to do it that way. So whatever Kounellis set up to do, David was willing to go with. I mean, he was from that time, I just think he was just thrilled to do it, you know, and to come up with something. He came up with something that was the opposite of the tent, you know, what he put in the tent, but it was just that thrill. And I think the photographs says it all.
I also, I don't know if this is working, is it?
Oh, hard.
Huh? Turned it off? Okay. I also just want to say, you know, even that cheekiness of the title and this happening at the time just after the war, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, sorry. It, you know, and the recovering of that in this moment and what that brings up, you know, from a European and American in that context, is in the military tents and at the American Academy, which is doing this very different project in terms of how it exists in Rome, or now the American Academy in Berlin. But despite all of that, you know, what I think is really interesting is when you have this conversation between two artists, and there's many, many, many shows where you can see these like really interesting juxtapositions. I think a Hammons boys show would be really interesting. But there are these moments when you can deal with these kind of, where you get these comparisons. And it's really interesting what ends up being something that resonates more with one. And they're different depending on who you are. It's a subjective kind of experience. But over time, certain work kind of grabs you in a different way. And for me, it was just really interesting to see that in this experience, even with the works on the wall. Like the Alphabetto works really do, like I'm into those for some reason, the kind of the musicality of them or the kind of beat in them. But there, and then there's these moments, because the show in Venice, I was kind of much more moved by certain Kounellis sculptures in that, and the cabinets on the wall, or the upside down furniture, the kind of the shoes, like you said, on the ceiling. There were some really moments that really do that. But it was in this context, looking at these two, I felt there was a noise, there was a kind of beat that was created by Kounellis, but I felt there was this kind of choreography that happened through Hammons. I think it was also the way that you guys brilliantly installed it. It was so beautifully installed and considered. But I've always find it interesting what happens to the way I perceive an artist after a dialogue or a conversation. And there was a show that we just saw recently in London. It was the two landscape painters, Turner and Constable. And it was so interesting because everyone would tell you Turner wins when you put those two next to each other in that conversation. But actually, Constable really holds you. And what happens when you're seeing that work? And there's something interesting of what happened to me in this experience, and that's kind of what I was referring to. So, you know, in terms of touch, even though you could feel those, and those materials were these things that were part of the kind of construction of this post-war Europe, and also extraction, what happens in the conversation and who kind of carries it through. There's something for me that was just striking about how David Hammons stands there. And I think David Hammons would be very, you know, I think it's impressive.
Well, thank you. We're going to draw the conversation to a close here. Thank you so much. Thank you to Adrienne, Julie and Stanley. I think it's a mark of an exhibition that brings together two quixotic artists in some ways together in a special exhibition. The fact we didn't have to rely on any of my prepared questions. And many interesting contributions and questions that came out that keep us questioning. And I think that's the brilliance that Stanley has referred to throughout. So thank you again.